Hey guys, at first glance, a rainy street in medieval Europe sounds almost peaceful, the sort of soft historical detail people imagine through stone walls, gray skies, and distant church bells. But once the rain actually touched the ground, those streets became something much stranger. Not simply wet, but unstable, foul, crowded, slippery, noisy, and deeply revealing about how medieval life really worked. So before we settle in, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me which piece of everyday history you'd like to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like on the video is a simple way to support the channel. And if you'd like more calm, curious journeys into the past, feel free to subscribe. Now, to understand what a medieval street felt like after rain, it helps to begin by setting aside the clean, cinematic version of the Middle Ages that modern people often carry in their minds. The real question is not just what those streets looked like, but why they were the way they were, why people tolerated them, and why rain could turn an ordinary road into an experience that was physical, social, and even political all at once. After rain, the first thing a person would have noticed was not beauty, but texture. In many medieval towns, especially before major paving improvements, the ground underfoot was not a flat, sealed surface in the modern sense. It was a compromise. Some streets had stretches of stone, some had gravel, some were packed earth, some were patched badly, and many contained a mixture of all three depending on wealth, location, and how much civic attention that part of town received. Even where stone existed, it did not guarantee comfort. Uneven cobbles, broken surfaces, shallow ruts, and badly maintained drainage could make a wet street feel treacherous rather than solid. A listener today might imagine mud simply as mud, but medieval mud was rarely only soil and rainwater. It was the collected residue of a living town. Horses moved through it, carts cut into it, dogs wandered through it, wastewater ran into it, household rubbish found its way into it, market scraps, ashes, straw, spilled ale, trampled vegetation, and manure all blended with rainfall into a surface that changed character hour by hour. It could be sticky in one stretch, slick in another, pooled and reflective near a ditch, and thick enough elsewhere to pull at a shoe or clog a cartwheel. And that is where one of the first misconceptions begins to fall away. Medieval streets were not unpleasant after rain because people were uniquely indifferent to cleanliness. They were difficult because urban infrastructure was limited, labor was expensive, local government was inconsistent, and thousands of daily acts had to occur in spaces that were never designed for the volume or intensity of use they actually received. Rain did not create the problem from nothing. It exposed the problem, loosened it, spread it, and made it impossible to ignore. Even the smell would have shifted with the weather. Dry weather could bake odors into a place until people partly adjusted to them. Rain changed that balance. It stirred what had settled. It drew material from alleys and thresholds into shared pathways. It woke up the drains, if drains existed at all, and where they were shallow, blocked, or poorly sloped, water lingered. Instead of washing a town clean in the modern sense, a steady shower might redistribute its filth. The result was not the fresh smell modern people associate with rain on pavement, but something heavier and more organic, a damp mixture of earth, rot, animals, smoke, and human presence. The soundscape changed too. This is easy to overlook, but it matters if we are trying to feel the street rather than merely picture it. A wet medieval street would have sounded softer in some ways and more chaotic in others. Dry dust did not rise. Footsteps became thicker, less crisp. Cartwheels dragged and jolted. Hooves struck stone differently when surfaces were slick. Water dripped from overhanging roofs. Gutters carried trickling streams. People lifted their hems, adjusted loads, cursed under their breath, shouted warnings, or called for passage in narrower lanes. After a hard rain, a busy town did not fall quiet. it became a place of negotiation. That negotiation was constant because streets were not used only for movement. They were places where work happened. Goods were unloaded, animals were driven, stalls were set up, neighbors exchanged information, apprentices ran errands, and waste was disposed of. In other words, the medieval street was not merely a route between important destinations. It was one of the places where life itself happened. So when rain made the street worse, it was not a minor inconvenience. It interfered with commerce, transport, reputation, timing, and even safety. A merchant trying to move cloth, grain, timber, or barrels of ale through a soaked street was not simply dealing with mud. He was dealing with delay. Delay meant labor costs, damaged goods, late arrivals, and irritation from customers. A butcher, baker, or brewer depended on movement through town. A servant sent on an errand had to return in reasonable time. A cart stuck in a rut could block others behind it. A horse losing footing could injure itself or those nearby. Rain, in that sense, exposed how dependent medieval towns were on fragile systems of circulation. In richer or more politically important urban centers, authorities sometimes tried to manage these conditions. Orders were issued about paving, cleaning, gutter maintenance, dumping practices, or obstruction of public ways. Residents might be required to maintain the stretch of street outside their property. But rules, as always, were easier to declare than to enforce. Some neighborhoods could afford attention. Others could not. Some streets mattered because officials used them, processions crossed them, or markets depended on them. Others remained neglected until conditions became impossible. So the experience of a rainy street also depended on status and location. The closer one was to wealth, authority, and civic pride, the more likely the road might be improved, though never perfectly. And even improvement could create its own discomfort. Stone paving sounds like a clean solution, but badly laid cobbles could become slick, unstable, and punishing under thin footwear. A road that saved a cart from sinking might still splash filth onto everyone walking nearby. Elevated stepping stones, sometimes placed in muddier streets, could help pedestrians cross difficult patches, but they also created bottlenecks, forced people close together, and did little when water rose beyond them. Solutions were often partial. Medieval people were not stupidly ignoring the problem. They were living inside technological and financial limits that made permanent solutions rare. Clothing shaped the experience as well. A modern person in waterproof boots and sealed outer layers can move through rain with relative confidence. Medieval clothing was better adapted to weather than people sometimes assume, especially with wool's useful properties, but it was hardly immune to wetness, dirt, and weight. Shoes could soak through, leather could stiffen and degrade, hems dragged, cloaks grew heavy. The lower edges of garments collected street matter with alarming speed. For women, especially in longer dress styles, and for anyone whose clothing hung low, the problem was constant. The street touched the body through fabric. This made movement tiring in a way modern viewers do not always expect. The challenge was not only avoiding puddles. It was carrying wetness with you. A street after rain did not end when you reached your destination. You brought it indoors on shoes, on hems, on cart wheels, and on the bodies of animals. Mud appeared in workshops, entryways, storerooms, and kitchens. The line between outdoor filth and indoor order was difficult to defend, especially in modest homes or commercial spaces with constant traffic. A rainy day could ripple through the entire rhythm of domestic life. There is also a social detail here that deserves attention. Wet streets made class differences more visible. A wealthy rider on horseback or someone carried with assistance experienced the same town differently from a laborer on foot. Better shoes, servants, access to cleaner routes, and the ability to remain indoors when necessary all softened the inconvenience. Poorer townspeople had less choice. They walked because they had to. They worked outside because they had to. They carried goods because they had to. Rain did not fall equally, but discomfort did not land equally either. And then there were the animals, without which medieval urban life cannot really be understood. Horses, mules, oxen, pigs, dogs, and other creatures moved through town not as decoration, but as active participants in its daily metabolism. After rain, their presence altered the street's behavior. Hooves churned soft ground. Wheels drawn by animals pressed ruts deeper. Droppings mixed into puddles and runoff. A nervous horse on slick stone introduced danger. A pig nosing through refuse turned wet edges of the street into a shifting mess. Medieval streets felt alive after rain, partly because they were not fully human spaces. They were shared, contested, and never entirely under control. This is one reason modern romantic images of the medieval town can feel so incomplete. They often frame narrow lanes, timbered houses, and flickering lantern light as charming, and in certain moments they may have been. But charm is easiest to imagine from a distance. Up close, after rain, the town pressed itself on the senses, clung to the shoe, splashed the ankle, tugged at the cart. It demanded attention with every step. The beauty, when it existed, was mixed with irritation, adaptation, and endurance. In fact, for many people, the street was a daily lesson in reading surfaces. One learned where water collected, which side of the lane held firmer footing, where eaves dumped runoff, where animals were usually driven, and which routes were worth avoiding after a storm. This practical knowledge mattered. A newcomer might see only disorder. A resident saw a map of risks. That map was part of urban intelligence, passed along through habit rather than written explanation. And still, rain had a way of humbling even the experienced. Because the problem with streets was not only what sat on the surface, but what lay beneath it. Repeated traffic created ruts, hollows, and weak spots. Repairs were often local and temporary. A section that seemed passable yesterday could become troublesome today. Water found the low points. Wheels carved deeper channels. Edges collapsed. In poorer areas especially, a street could be less like a maintained public surface and more like a corridor of accumulated wear. This mattered especially at market hours. Medieval towns were rhythmic places, and certain streets became far more difficult when rain met commerce. Imagine a lane crowded with sellers, customers, baskets, carts, apprentices, and animals, all trying to move while avoiding the worst ground. The mud was not just a physical obstacle. It slowed transactions, raised tempers, and altered the dignity of everyday movement. A respectable person trying to stay composed while lifting clothing out of foul water, edging past a wheel, and protecting purchased goods was participating in a very ordinary medieval drama. There was, too, a kind of irony in the relation between rain and public health. Water was necessary. Filth was dangerous. Cleansing mattered. Yet the urban environment was not arranged in a way that allowed rain to act as a simple purifier. Instead, it often redistributed contamination. The same water that softened the street could carry waste toward wells, doorways, and low-lying spaces. Medieval people did not think about hygiene in precisely modern microbial terms, but they were not blind to corruption, stench, stagnation, or the dangers of foul surroundings. Their world contained practical knowledge, even when it lacked later science. That practical knowledge shows up in rules, complaints, repairs, and repeated efforts to control runoff and refuse, which is another useful correction to modern assumptions. If medieval records contain so many demands about cleaning streets, maintaining drains, or preventing obstruction, that does not prove nobody cared. It proves people cared enough to keep arguing. Civic frustration is evidence of awareness. Rain made that awareness urgent. And perhaps that is the deeper truth hidden in something as simple as a wet street. It was a place where nature, infrastructure, economy, class, and habit all met under pressure. After rain, the medieval town could no longer pretend to be smoother, cleaner, or more orderly than it really was. Water revealed the seams. It showed which authorities were effective, which repairs held, which neighborhoods mattered, and which people had to absorb the inconvenience with their own bodies. So when we picture someone stepping out into a medieval street after rainfall, we should not imagine only atmosphere. We should imagine calculation. Where do I place my foot? How long will this take? What will this do to the goods I carry? Can the cart pass? Will the horse slide? Is the lane blocked? How much of this am I going to bring back home with me? And in that small sequence of questions, the Middle Ages become less distant and more human, because inconvenience, after all, has always been one of history's most universal experiences. But the street after rain was not only a story of discomfort. It was also a test of the town's hidden design, and the closer we look at drains, ditches, paving choices, and the politics of maintenance, the more clearly we begin to see that what felt like simple mud was actually part of a much larger struggle over how medieval people tried, and often failed, to keep urban life moving. What felt like simple mud was actually part of a much larger struggle over how medieval people tried, and often failed, to keep urban life moving. Once you begin to follow that struggle more closely, the street after rain stops looking like a natural inconvenience and starts looking like an argument written into the ground. Drainage, in theory, was one of the most obvious answers. If water could be guided away, if waste could be separated from foot traffic, if roads could be raised, cambered, or paved more effectively, then a town could become more manageable in wet weather. But theory was the easy part. The actual medieval town was built slowly, irregularly, and often without a single master plan. Streets followed older paths. Houses pressed outward over time. Workshops expanded where they could. Market activity accumulated in places that made commercial sense, not sanitary sense. And so the movement of water through a town was often forced through spaces that had never been fully designed to handle it. Some towns used side gutters, shallow channels running along the edges of streets where rainwater and household runoff might collect and move away. In wealthier or better organized places, these could make a real difference. But they demanded maintenance, and maintenance was always the fragile point in medieval civic life. A gutter worked only if it remained clear enough to carry water. Once choked with straw, scraps, silt, manure, broken material, and the endless debris of urban life, it became another obstacle. Instead of removing the problem, it held the problem in place until the next rain redistributed it. That means the condition of a street after rain was often the result of many unnoticed days before the rain ever arrived. A blocked channel, an ignored rut, a neglected ditch, a collapsed edge, a careless dumping habit, a badly repaired section of paving. All of these could wait quietly through dry weather. Then the storm came, and the whole neglected system declared itself at once. Water is impartial in that way. It reveals not only nature but habit, and a medieval town was made as much from habit as from stone. This is one reason local authorities were so often drawn into disputes over roads and cleanliness. Medieval governments, where they existed in practical form, were not modern municipal bureaucracies with stable budgets and uniform enforcement. Power was fractured. Responsibility was layered. A town council might issue orders. A lord might claim rights. Parish might influence local practice. Property holders might be expected to maintain the frontage before their doors. Craft guilds might have their own interests in particular streets. And ordinary residents, meanwhile, still had to get through the day. So the politics of the wet street were rarely abstract. They were deeply immediate. A resident who allowed waste to accumulate outside his property might not simply be judged untidy. He might be seen as contributing to a larger breakdown in shared life. A cart owner who damaged a paved section through heavy use could become part of a dispute about who paid for repairs. A butcher, dyer, tanner, brewer, or other tradesmen dealing with messy materials could be viewed not only as economically necessary but physically burdensome to neighbors. Rain made these tensions visible. What in dry weather could remain tolerable or arguable became difficult to deny once the street turned soft, slick, or foul. And yet medieval people continued to use these streets with a level of skill that can be easy to underestimate. There is a tendency in modern thinking to imagine that if conditions were bad, daily life simply collapsed into misery. But life rarely works that neatly. People adapted. They adjusted routes, timed errands, laid temporary materials, wore practical footwear when they could, relied on local knowledge, and developed expectations that were entirely realistic for their environment. They did not need the street to be ideal. They needed it to be usable often enough. That is an important distinction, because it helps explain why poor conditions could persist for so long without producing total paralysis. A street did not have to be comfortable to function. It had to remain just passable enough for trade, labor, travel, and social life to continue. That threshold could be surprisingly low. A cart that could still grind through a muddy lane, even if slowly, meant the lane remained economically alive. A pedestrian who could pick a careful route along the least saturated edge still had a path. A market delayed was not the same as a market canceled. Medieval urban life was full of friction, and rain simply added to a friction people already expected. The problem came when that friction became cumulative, when roads deteriorated to the point that movement, commerce, and order all began to suffer together. This is where paving acquired meaning beyond simple convenience. To pave a street was not merely to make it more pleasant. It was to signal value. Important approaches to churches, central marketplaces, major thoroughfares, and politically visible districts were more likely to receive investment because they mattered to power, ceremony, and revenue. A muddy lane in a peripheral quarter might inconvenience the poor. A muddy street leading to a market might inconvenience money. These were not treated the same. Rain therefore exposed the hierarchy of the town not only through who suffered most, but through which surfaces had been deemed worth stabilizing in the first place. Even within paved areas, however, solutions remained uneven. Medieval paving was labor-intensive, expensive, and vulnerable to damage. Stones shifted, foundations sank, constant pressure from wheels and animals wore surfaces down. Repairs might be piecemeal. One stretch of street could feel firm, another jarring, another treacherously slick. In some cases, newly improved sections may even have made adjacent neglected sections feel worse by contrast, forcing traffic into narrow usable corridors and concentrating movement where the ground held up best. Improvement did not necessarily spread smoothly. It often created islands of order within broader disorder. That unevenness also shaped the body's memory of the town. A person walking the same route through a city after rain would not remember the entire experience as one continuous condition. He or she would remember transitions. Here the stones are firm. Here the gutter overflows. Here the lane narrows and one must wait for a cart to pass. Here the surface tilts and water gathers. Here the house fronts jut out and drip from their eaves. Here the smell worsens. Here the market churns the ground to paste. Medieval streets were experienced segment by segment, almost like a chain of negotiations, each with its own risk and rhythm. The architecture above the street mattered as much as the ground below it. In many towns, upper stories projected outward, narrowing lanes and shaping how water fell. Rooflines did not politely direct rain away from public movement in the way modern drainage systems try to do. Water could spill, drip, and pour from buildings into already crowded passageways. In narrow streets especially, This intensified the feeling that rain was not just descending from the sky but arriving from all sides. A person might avoid one puddle only to be struck by a spill from above or squeezed toward the muddier edge by someone passing in the opposite direction. This is another place where the physical experience becomes surprisingly intimate. To move through a medieval street after rain was not to glide through a scenic backdrop. It was to remain alert to surfaces, edges, shoulders, odors, animals, garments, and overhead hazards. The body had to participate in the architecture of the town. It had to lean, sidestep, pause, judge distance, and accept minor defeats. A wet sleeve, a splashed hem, a dirty shoe, a delayed arrival. These were not memorable disasters. They were ordinary proofs that the town remained stronger than the individual moving through it. And still, within this discomfort, the street retained its social energy. In fact, bad conditions could sharpen social awareness rather than reduce it. People noticed who yielded space and who did not. They noticed which carts forced others into muck. They noticed which households kept their frontages cleaner, which shops remained accessible, which officials actually ordered repairs, and which promises were empty. Rain did not wash social meaning away, concentrated it. Courtesy, neglect, status, impatience, and authority all became more visible when the ground itself was difficult. There is something almost paradoxical here. The worse a street became after rain, the more clearly one could read the structure of the town through it. You could see where money had gone. You could feel where labor had not. You could detect which trades burdened the public way most heavily. You could sense how much urban life depended on the imperfect coordination of private behavior and public responsibility. A wet street was not merely an environmental event. It was evidence. And evidence mattered because medieval townspeople complained. They petitioned. They argued. They issued fines. They called for paving, cleaning, ditching, and regulation. This is one of the most revealing features of urban history. The repetition of such concerns tells us not simply that the problem existed, but that people expected some response. They may not have expected perfection, but they did expect effort. There is a difference between accepting inconvenience and accepting neglect. Medieval people were often prepared to endure the first. The second was more politically sensitive. Sometimes the struggle over streets intersected with broader questions of morality and order. Filth was not only unpleasant. It could be associated with disorderly living, poor discipline, or communal failure. A badly maintained public way suggested that people were not fulfilling obligations to neighbors, to authorities, or to the town as a collective body. In religious cultures that paid close attention to order, duty, and visible conduct, the condition of shared space could carry symbolic as well as practical weight. A muddy street after rain might be physically troublesome, but it could also serve as a visible reminder that urban life required constant moral as well as material maintenance. This did not mean medieval people thought exactly like later reformers, nor that every dirty lane produced an ethical crisis. But it does remind us that the street was never only a piece of infrastructure. It was part of the public face of the town. Processions crossed it. Traders used it. Outsiders judged the place by it. Residents encountered one another on it. If rain turned that surface into a churned mixture of inconvenience and waste, then the reputation of the town itself could feel slightly diminished. Even in eras without modern public health language, people knew that a badly kept environment reflected badly on those who lived within it. At the same time, we should be careful not to imagine a single medieval experience. A large commercial city, a smaller market town, a cathedral center, and a modest regional settlement could all feel very different after rain. Climate mattered. Soil mattered. Wealth mattered. Local custom mattered. Some places developed more durable paving traditions. Some had stronger administrative cultures. Some were built on terrain that drained better naturally. Others struggled perpetually with low ground, traffic density, or poor planning inherited over generations. The medieval street was never one thing. It was a range of local solutions, many of them imperfect, repeatedly tested by weather. And yet across that variety, certain sensations seemed to return again and again. Instability underfoot, the blending of natural and human waste, the difficulty of separating passage from labor, and the constant dependence on small acts of maintenance that might or might not happen in time. What makes the rainy street so revealing is that it gathers all of those realities into a single experience. One storm could turn infrastructure into texture. It could convert governance into a puddle, class into a cleaner route, and economy into a cart will half sunk at the center of the lane. For children, servants, laborers, porters, market women, messengers, clerics, craftsmen, and travelers, those realities would have been felt differently, but they would have been felt. A porter carrying weight through slick streets measured the town in effort. A householder watched water carry street matter toward the doorway. A merchant calculated delay. A priest heading toward service lifted his garments and hoped for decent footing. An apprentice sent out in poor weather learned very quickly that rain altered hierarchy only slightly. Work still had to be done. That may be one of the most quietly powerful truths here. Weather changed the medium of urban life, but rarely its demands, which helps explain why medieval streets were so often caught between improvisation and ambition. People improvised because they had to. Authorities invested when they could. Repairs happened unevenly. Complaints returned. Conditions worsened and improved in cycles. No final solution fully arrived. The town remained a place in process, always negotiating with the water that fell on it and the waste it produced. After rain, that negotiation became visible to everyone. And from there, the story moves naturally outward, because once we understand the politics and engineering of the street itself, we can begin to see how rain reshaped the adjoining spaces as well, the thresholds, shops, workshops, inns, market edges, and household entrances where the outside world kept trying to come in. The thresholds, shops, workshops, inns, market edges, and household entrances were where the outside world kept trying to come in, and after rain, that boundary between street and shelter became one of the most important lines in medieval daily life. A modern person often thinks of a doorway as a simple transition, a quick step from outdoors to indoors. In a medieval town after rain, it was more like a defensive position. The street did not politely remain outside. It arrived on boots, on hems, on cart wheels, on the paws of dogs, on the hooves of horses, and in the slow creeping of damp itself. To keep a house, shop, or workshop functional meant constantly negotiating with what the street wanted to deposit there. This was especially true in homes that opened directly onto busy roads. Many urban houses were not separated from public movement by wide gardens, enclosed driveways, or deep front halls. The street and the household lived close together. A front room might serve partly as a commercial space, a workshop, a point of exchange, or simply the most active entrance to family life. Rain turned that entrance into a zone of repeated cleaning, wiping, lifting, and protection. Imagine a baker whose trade depended on early movement through town. Flour deliveries, customers arriving, apprentices carrying goods, and ovens that could not simply wait for the weather to improve. After rain, the concern was not only whether customers could reach the shop, but what entered with them. Mud near flour was not a minor annoyance. Wetness near stored fuel mattered. Dirty foot traffic through working space changed the pace of the day. Even if the bakery remained open and profitable, the street had already entered the labor. The same was true for blacksmiths, cobblers, brewers, cloth sellers, and countless others. A workshop floor after rain reflected the street outside. Shoes needed more repair because wet roads damaged them. Cart fittings suffered from harder use. Cloaks and garments arrived stained or soaked. Barrels moved more slowly. Deliveries took longer. Animals were harder to manage. In that sense, rain did not interrupt urban economy from the outside. It altered the economy from within, changing how labor itself felt. Inns provide another revealing example. Travelers arriving after rain did not arrive as elegant figures from a painting. They arrived wet, dirty, tired, and carrying the road with them. Their horses needed attention. Their boots carried half the lane inside. Their baggage might be damp. The innkeeper's task was not simply hospitality but containment. Where do the animals go? Where can wet clothing dry? How do you protect bedding, food stores, and communal rooms from the physical consequences of travel in bad weather? An inn after rainfall was therefore a place where the geography of the town became visible indoors. You could often tell what the roads had been like simply by watching arrivals. Mud on boots was information. Delayed merchants, splashed hems, damaged goods, frustrated riders, all of it reported on the condition of the streets before anyone said a word. The road entered the building before the traveler even spoke. Markets, too, became a kind of weather instrument. The edges of market space were especially vulnerable because they sat at the meeting point of movement and concentration. Large numbers of people gathered there. Goods were handled constantly, animals passed through, and temporary structures often made permanent cleanliness impossible. After rain, a market might still function, but it did so with altered dignity. Sellers raised goods higher, customers picked their way more carefully, and the simple act of purchasing bread, fish, vegetables, or cloth required a physical choreography shaped by puddles and churned ground. For women managing household purchases, servants sent with instructions, or children carrying small errands, the market after rain could become a lesson in practical strategy. Which path is least muddy? Which stall can be reached without ruining the hem of a dress? Which basket must be balanced differently to avoid splashing? These are small questions, but history is often made from small repeated decisions. The shape of a town lived in such details. There is also a quiet social reality here. Cleanliness, or the appearance of it, mattered for dignity. A respectable household did not necessarily have the power to control the street, but it cared about how it appeared within that street. Mud on clothing, stains on hems, splashes on better garments. These were not merely practical frustrations. They could affect how one was seen. Wealth could protect against some of this through servants, better clothing, horses, or reduced exposure, but no one was entirely separate from the environment of the town. Rain briefly democratized inconvenience, even if it never distributed it equally. This was particularly true around churches. Religious life was not neatly detached from street conditions. Parish churches sat within the same urban realities as markets and workshops. People approached them through the same roads, with the same mud on their shoes, under the same weather. A procession after rain was not a graceful abstraction. It was a logistical exercise. Clergy, parishioners, and civic officials all had to move through real streets. Mud, drainage, and access affected sacred routine as much as secular trade. There is something important in that. It reminds us that medieval people did not experience spiritual life floating above ordinary material inconvenience. Worship happened in the same world as wet wool, blocked gutters, and slippery paving stones. The holy and the inconvenient shared the same threshold. A priest stepping carefully through a muddy lane to conduct mass was still part of the same urban system as the butcher and the brewer. Household interiors themselves adapted to this constant intrusion. Floors in many homes were not designed around the assumption of perfectly clean entry. Straw, rushes, and other floor coverings could help manage comfort and dampness, though they also created their own maintenance demands. Shoes might be removed or cleaned as best as possible depending on custom, wealth, and circumstance. Items were lifted from lower ground when necessary. Drying spaces mattered. Fireplaces became not only sources of warmth but tools against wetness carried in from outside. Rain then changed domestic rhythm. Laundry became more complicated. Fuel management became more urgent. Dry wood mattered. Damp clothing had to be dealt with before it became a longer problem. Children tracked street conditions indoors with cheerful indifference, while adults dealt with the consequences. The weather outside was never only outside. It restructured the timetable of the house. And here again, class shaped experience. In a wealthier urban home, there might be servants to manage cleaning, more room to separate wet from dry, better flooring, stronger roofing, and more resilient materials. In a poorer household, a bad day in the street could mean a bad evening indoors. Less space meant less separation between work, storage, animals, and sleep. Dampness lingered longer. Mud mattered more. The threshold was thinner because the margin for disorder was smaller. It is tempting to imagine that medieval people simply became numb to these discomforts, but that is rarely how ordinary hardship works. People notice inconvenience most sharply when it repeats. One bad rainy day can be shrugged off. A season of them becomes a form of exhaustion. Complaints about roads, drainage, and urban filth were often repeated precisely because people felt the accumulation. They did not stop caring. They learned how much caring cost. Even leisure, where it existed, bent around these realities. Visiting neighbors, attending gatherings, crossing town for social obligations, all of it changed with weather. Rain altered who stayed home, who arrived late, who sent someone else, and who simply accepted the mess. The social map of a town shifted subtly after storms. Some spaces became more active because people sought shelter. Others became temporarily avoided because reaching them demanded too much effort. Children likely experienced the street differently, of course. For them, muddy spaces could be sites of play, curiosity, and risk rather than only frustration. But even that reveals something about the medieval street. It was never a cleanly regulated adult environment. It was shared, improvised, and constantly negotiated by bodies of different ages, statuses, and purposes. Rain made that shared nature impossible to ignore. There were also seasons when the problem deepened beyond ordinary inconvenience. A single rainfall was one thing. Repeated wet weather could produce cumulative instability. Roads softened further. Repairs failed faster. Stored goods became harder to protect. Drainage systems lost whatever fragile efficiency they possessed. In such periods, the street no longer felt temporarily unpleasant. It felt structurally unreliable. Travel between towns slowed. Supply chains strained. Prices could feel the weather before people named the cause. This is where the muddy street connects to larger economic history. Urban life depended on rural movement. Grain, firewood, livestock, wool, wine, salt, fish, and countless other necessities had to enter the town somehow. If roads beyond the walls became difficult, the town felt it. A cart delayed on a country road eventually became a missing delivery in the market square. Rain blurred the distinction between urban inconvenience and regional vulnerability. And because medieval transport depended so heavily on animal power, the condition of roads was always partly a question of animal endurance. A horse pulling through wet streets spent energy differently from one moving on firm ground. Hooves slipped, harnesses strained, oxen moved slower. Feed requirements mattered. Animals were not neutral machines. Their fatigue was part of the economic equation. A wet road could make the town more expensive before anyone opened an account book. This is another reason streets after rain carried emotional weight. They represented uncertainty. Will the merchant arrive? Will the fish still be good? Will the grain cart reach town before the market closes? Will the messenger return tonight or tomorrow? Medieval people lived close to logistical fragility, and weather was one of its most reliable reminders. Rain on the street was often rain in the mind, a quiet recalculation of what might now be delayed. And yet, despite all this, life did not stop. Bells still rang. Bread still had to be baked. Contracts still had to be honored. Markets still opened. Children still ran errands. Priests still crossed the lane. A shoemaker still bent over damaged leather made worse by the road outside. That continuity may be the most historically honest detail of all. Medieval life was not dramatic because disaster arrived every day. It was demanding because ordinary life required persistence through ordinary difficulty. That persistence shaped memory. Ask someone living in such a town what rain meant, and they might not answer with poetry. They might answer with the smell near the drain outside the house, the feeling of wet leather by evening, the way the market square changed color, the frustration of a delayed cart, or the exact stone near the church door that was always dangerously slick. History often survives best in specific annoyances, and sometimes those annoyances became serious enough to provoke larger change. A repeatedly flooded street near an important market might finally force repaving. A dangerous crossing near a church might lead to better drainage. A politically embarrassing roadway near civic authority might suddenly become a priority. Improvement often followed irritation rather than vision. People endured until endurance became too costly, which means the medieval street after rain was not just a symbol of hardship. It was also one of the quiet engines of urban development. Frustration created pressure. Pressure created repair. Repair altered movement. Movement altered trade. Trade altered power. Sometimes the history of a town changed not because of a grand decree, but because enough people were tired of stepping into the same mud. And nowhere was that tension between endurance and change more visible than at the edges of the town itself, where streets met gates, where travelers arrived from country roads, and where rain turned the boundary between urban order and the wider landscape into its own complicated world, the edges of the town itself, where streets met gates, where travelers arrived from country roads, and where rain turned the boundary between urban order and the wider landscape into its own complicated world, the experience of a medieval street changed once again. Inside the walls, however imperfectly, there was at least the idea of civic control. Streets might be muddy, drains might fail, paving might be uneven, but someone could still be blamed, fined, or petitioned. Outside the gates, that sense of control weakened quickly. Roads leading into town were shaped by weather, traffic, local terrain, and long habits of use far more than by consistent maintenance. After rain, these approach roads often became the first true test of whether a town remained connected to the world around it. A merchant arriving from the countryside did not experience the medieval street as one single thing. He moved through stages. First the country road, deeply rutted, soft under wheels, bordered by hedges, fields, or woodland, its condition depending on recent use and the season. Then the slower compression toward the town. More traffic, more animals, more carts, more waiting. Then the gate itself, where movement narrowed, taxes might be collected, identities questioned, goods inspected, and tempers shortened. And finally the transition into urban streets, where the road's mud did not disappear but changed character, becoming mixed with the concentrated life of the town. Rain made each stage heavier. Country roads could become nearly symbolic of medieval frustration because they exposed how dependent towns were on landscapes they could not fully govern. A dirt track serving well enough in dry weather might become a corridor of exhaustion after several days of rain. Wheels sank, horses strained, axles broke, goods shifted dangerously. Travel slowed not by dramatic catastrophe, but by repeated resistance. A journey measured in hours might quietly become a full day. A delivery expected by noon might arrive at dusk. And unlike urban inconvenience, rural roads often offered fewer witnesses and fewer immediate solutions. A cart stuck in town caused public irritation. A cart stuck miles away in wet ground created absence. The baker waiting for flour did not see the problem. He simply felt the consequence. Rain turned logistics into uncertainty, and uncertainty shaped the emotional weather of the town long before anyone looked at the sky. Town gates themselves were especially revealing places after rain. They were thresholds in every sense: military, economic, social, and physical. They controlled entry, but they also concentrated mud. Animals slowed there. Carts paused there. People gathered there. If the roads outside were wet, the gate became a funnel through which that entire condition entered urban life. Imagine the ground near a busy gate after a week of rain. Hooves had churned it repeatedly. Wheels had cut grooves deeper each day. Water sat where traffic was heaviest. Refuse collected where people paused. Guards stood in the same difficult conditions as everyone else, trying to maintain order in a place designed for control but constantly challenged by weather and volume. A gate was supposed to symbolize strength. After rain, it often symbolized patience. This was particularly true on market days. Rural sellers bringing produce, livestock, or materials into town had little choice about timing. Delay could mean lost income. Perishable goods could not politely wait for ideal weather. So people came anyway, pushing through bad roads because economic life required it. The town gate became crowded not only with people but with urgency. Rain did not cancel necessity. It merely made necessity dirtier. There is also an important emotional difference between mud inside and outside the walls. Urban mud was irritating but familiar. Rural mud carried uncertainty. It suggested distance, delay, and vulnerability. A traveler on a country road after rain was more exposed to weather, to injury, to theft, to simple exhaustion. Reaching the town gate could therefore feel like genuine relief, even if the street beyond was hardly clean. Civilization, in this sense, was sometimes defined less by comfort than by the presence of witnesses. An inn near the gate benefited from exactly this psychology. Travelers arriving wet and tired did not require luxury first. They required stability, a dry fire, a place for animals, solid walls, and food that did not demand another hour of movement. Inns near gates were therefore transitional spaces between the unpredictability of the road and the managed disorder of town life. Their floors after rain must have told entire stories. Clay from one road, straw from another, the smell of wet horses, cloaks steaming near the hearth. For gatekeepers and officials, rain created administrative problems as well. Toll collection depended on flow. Inspection depended on order. But soaked travelers, delayed wagons, and irritable merchants rarely produce orderly scenes. If a cart was damaged near the entrance, everyone behind it suffered. If livestock panicked in slippery conditions, movement stalled. If the ground itself became too unstable, the gate area could become a place of repeated obstruction. Civic power was measured there not only in walls and guards, but in how well movement could be restored. And that restoration mattered politically. A prosperous town wanted roads that brought wealth inward. Merchants remembered difficult approaches. Traders compared routes. Pilgrims discussed safer or easier paths. A town with miserable access might still survive, but inconvenience had economic consequences. Medieval urban reputation was shaped partly by what it felt like to arrive there. This is one reason bridges were so significant. Where roads crossed rivers or marshy ground, a bridge could transform not just convenience but identity. After rain, a good bridge was not a luxury. It was a form of economic confidence. It reduced delay, preserved goods, protected animals, and made a route reliable in seasons when roads elsewhere failed. Bridges concentrated movement much like gates did, but they also represented a victory over landscape that muddy roads constantly threatened to reverse. Yet bridges introduced their own bottlenecks. Narrow crossings forced waiting. Tolls created frustration. Flooding could damage approaches even when the structure itself held. And because everyone needed the same crossing, maintenance became politically charged. Who pays? Who repairs? Who profits? Medieval infrastructure was rarely neutral. A wet road leading to a bad bridge could turn practical inconvenience into civic resentment very quickly. Pilgrimage routes reveal another side of this world. Many towns depended partly on religious travelers, and pilgrims, unlike merchants, often arrived with fewer resources and greater vulnerability to weather. After rain, the road into town could shape not only their physical exhaustion but their spiritual mood. A shrine approached through deep mud, wet clothing, and aching feet was not experienced in abstraction. Devotion moved through the body first. There is something quietly important in that image. Sacred travel measured in mud. It reminds us again that medieval spirituality did not float above infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and streets shaped religious life just as surely as sermons did. Rain on the road to a cathedral was still part of the pilgrimage. For ordinary villagers coming to town less dramatically, perhaps for weekly trade or legal obligations, the same roads carried a different kind of pressure. Towns represented markets, courts, taxes, opportunities, and authority. Reaching them mattered. After rain, the journey itself could feel like a negotiation with power. If the road was poor, the burden of participation grew heavier. A person bringing eggs to market, paying dues, or answering a summons did not experience the town as an abstract institution. They experienced it first as the difficulty of getting there. That difficulty helps explain why road maintenance could become a matter of real local concern rather than a small technical issue. A bad road was not merely unpleasant. It could distort access to justice, trade, worship, and community life. When rain repeatedly turned routes into obstacles, it affected who could arrive, who arrived late, and who stopped trying altogether. Animals, again, were central to this story. Medieval roads were read through the feet of horses and oxen as much as through human shoes. A horse slipping on a wet stone approach to a gate was not just an inconvenience. It was risk, expense, and potential injury. An ox struggling with a loaded wagon through softened ground represented labor stretched toward failure. People watched roads through their animals because animals translated surface conditions into survival. And because animals produced waste wherever they moved, the boundary between country road and urban street was never clean. What entered through the gate was not only commerce. It was the full physical presence of transport itself. Manure, broken straw, damaged wheels, exhausted beasts, tired people. All of it crossed together. Rain thickened that transfer. It made the connection between rural production and urban consumption visible underfoot. There was also seasonality in how people remembered these spaces. Spring rains could be especially frustrating because they arrived alongside agricultural urgency. Autumn wetness mattered differently, touching harvest movement and preparation for winter. Winter thaw could create its own unstable surfaces, half frozen, half dissolved. Medieval people did not experience rain as one single condition. They understood it through agricultural calendars, religious seasons, and local expectations. The same muddy road in March and October carried different meanings. And yet, despite all this variation, one pattern remains constant. Arrival mattered. To come into town after rain was to move from uncertainty into negotiation. The road outside tested endurance. The street inside tested adaptation. Neither was easy, but they belonged to different worlds. The gate stood between them not as a clean line, but as a place where those worlds mixed. That mixture shaped memory deeply. A traveler might forget the details of a council chamber but remember exactly how the lane outside the north gate smelled after rain. A merchant might forget a conversation but remember the wheel nearly lost in the approach road. A pilgrim might remember the relief of seeing stone walls through mist more vividly than the sermon heard the next day. Physical difficulty often anchors historical memory more firmly than ceremony does. This is why descriptions of medieval streets matter so much. They are not minor background details. They are evidence of how people inhabited systems larger than themselves. Governance, trade, class, religion, and architecture all eventually reached the footstep. After rain, that truth became impossible to ignore. And nowhere did footsteps become more revealing than in the narrowest parts of town. The lanes where space itself became scarce, where drainage failed fastest, where neighbors lived almost on top of one another, and where a simple walk after rainfall could feel less like travel and more like passing through the private life of the entire street. In the narrowest parts of town, where space itself became scarce, where drainage failed fastest, where neighbors lived almost on top of one another, and where a simple walk after rainfall could feel less like travel and more like passing through the private life of the entire street. The medieval city revealed some of its most intimate truths. These were the lanes people often forget when imagining the past. Grand market squares, cathedral approaches, castle roads, these survive in memory because they sound important. But much of ordinary urban life unfolded in smaller passages. Crooked alleys between timber houses, service lanes behind workshops, tight residential streets where upper floors leaned toward each other so closely that the sky itself seemed narrower. After rain, these places changed character faster than anywhere else. A wide road at least allowed water somewhere to go, even badly. A narrow lane trapped it. The ground held moisture longer. Sunlight reached less. Air moved differently. Roof runoff concentrated into fewer spaces. If waste disposal was already imperfect, and it usually was, then wet weather turned inconvenience into intimacy. What was discarded by one household became everyone's problem by evening. This is where the modern imagination often hesitates, because the reality is less picturesque than people expect. Medieval lanes were not simply charming old passages lined with lantern light and quiet stone. Many were loud with domestic work, full of smells, and physically crowded by the practical fact that households did not separate life into neat modern categories. Cooking, washing, repairs, trade, storage, animals, and argument all pressed close to the street. Rain did not interrupt this closeness. It intensified it. A person walking through such a lane after rainfall might hear a bucket emptied from an upper window, step aside for someone carrying firewood, flatten against a wall to let a handcart pass, smell wet straw from a stable corner, and notice which doorstep had tried to defend itself with fresh rushes or boards against the spreading mud. Movement was social because privacy was limited. To pass through the lane was to be noticed. This is one reason reputation mattered so strongly in medieval towns. Your neighbors did not need rumors alone to know your habits. They watched your doorway. They saw whether your frontage was kept, whether waste lingered too long, whether deliveries arrived, whether animals were controlled, whether family tensions spilled visibly into public space. After rain, when the street made everyone more aware of thresholds and maintenance, those observations sharpened. The lane was a place where domestic responsibility became public evidence. If one household allowed drainage to fail, others paid for it. If someone dumped carelessly, the puddle spread beyond private boundaries. If a butcher's scraps or a tanner's runoff worsened conditions, neighbors noticed immediately. This created a constant low-level politics of blame and tolerance. Medieval urban life depended on people enduring one another, but endurance had limits, and wet weather often found them. This helps explain why disputes over apparently small matters could become surprisingly fierce. A blocked gutter was not just a blocked gutter. It might mean a flooded entrance, damaged goods, worse smells, harder access for customers, or the sense that one family's negligence had become another family's burden. Rain turned private habits into public consequences. And because these lanes were often physically irregular, shaped over generations rather than planned from the start, solutions were rarely elegant. One doorway might sit slightly higher, protected from pooling water. Another might suffer every storm. One family might afford better repairs. Another might rely on temporary boards and constant sweeping. Fairness, in practical terms, was often impossible. Geography itself took sides. There is something deeply human in that. People remembered not only events, but patterns. Which house always flooded first? Which corner smelled worst after summer rain? Which stretch froze dangerously in winter? Which neighbor never cleaned properly? History lived in repeated local knowledge. The lane was not mapped only by buildings, but by grievances. Children knew these maps too, though differently. They knew where puddles lasted longest, where older residents shouted most quickly, where dogs were likely to bark, where carts made the ground dangerous, where hidden dry paths could still be found along walls. A rainy lane was not only an adult problem. It was a small geography of caution and opportunity. For women managing household work, especially in denser urban quarters, these spaces were often central to daily movement. Water had to be carried, goods collected, errands completed, children watched, clothing managed, neighbors negotiated. Rain added weight to ordinary labor without changing the expectation that the labor would still be done. That quiet persistence shaped much of medieval urban life more than any dramatic event ever could. It also shaped how time was felt. A 10-minute errand in dry weather could become a frustrating half-hour in wet conditions, especially where narrow streets forced waiting and detours. Delays accumulated invisibly. Bread later than expected, laundry harder to dry, a missed exchange at market, a child sent back because the path was too difficult. None of it sounded historically grand, yet this was the true tempo of ordinary life. There is a temptation to think of history only through major decisions. Kings, wars, laws, revolutions. But for most people, history often arrived as friction. Wet shoes, slow roads, a spoiled delivery, a dangerous step on worn stone. Rain in a narrow street could alter the day more completely than royal politics. And still, those politics existed here too, though quietly. Narrow urban districts often reflected older inequalities. Wealthier residents could sometimes avoid the worst streets, or at least leave them more easily. Poorer districts were more likely to suffer from bad drainage, overcrowding, and limited repair. If a lane remained perpetually difficult after rain, it was rarely an accident untouched by power. It often reflected where investment had not gone. That absence could be felt physically. Mud was not abstract. It was class underfoot. This is one of the strongest expectation reversals in medieval urban history. People often imagine wealth in terms of luxury objects, fine clothing, silverware, private chambers. But one of the most meaningful luxuries might simply have been easier movement. Cleaner access, better paving, fewer ruined shoes, less time lost to navigating a failing street. Comfort was sometimes infrastructure disguised as status. And in the tightest lanes, infrastructure was difficult to improve because every change touched someone's property, someone's rights, someone's habits. Widening, draining, repaving, redirecting runoff. None of it happened without conflict. A projected upper floor might protect valuable indoor space while making the lane darker and wetter below. A workshop might need access that neighbors hated. A drainage solution for one house might worsen another's problem. Medieval streets were collaborative systems managed by people who did not always wish to collaborate. This made compromise physical. You could see it in sloped stones, patched walls, makeshift walkways, repaired drains, and the endless evidence of adaptation rather than perfection. A lane after rain was a record of negotiations layered over decades. Night made these streets feel different again. After rainfall, darkness added uncertainty. Medieval towns did not offer reliable modern lighting. A familiar lane could become hazardous when puddles were hidden, stones slick, and refuse harder to avoid. Returning home after evening prayer, after work, or from a neighbor's house required a kind of memory-based navigation. People trusted their feet partly because their eyes could not do all the work. And sound became more important. The splash of someone ahead, the wheel of a late cart, the warning call from a window, the bark of a dog near a gate, footsteps approaching too quickly in a narrow space. Rain altered not only the surface of the street, but the way the body listened to it. A wet lane at night was not silent history. It was a place of careful attention. There is also the question of fear, though not always in dramatic form. Narrow streets after dark, especially in poor weather, created vulnerability. Slips, theft, unwanted encounters, and simple accidents became more likely. For women, servants traveling alone, older residents, or anyone carrying something valuable, the journey home could demand calculation. Which route is safer? Which corner is better lit by a tavern's spill of light? Which neighbor is likely still awake? Medieval safety was often social rather than institutional. Rain made even familiar places briefly uncertain. Taverns and alehouses in these districts played an interesting role here. They were not simply places of drinking, but recognizable islands of warmth, light, and witness. After rain, their thresholds became muddy borders between discomfort and temporary shelter. People entered carrying the street with them, and tavern floors, like in floors, recorded the weather in stains and straw. News moved there with wet boots. Someone delayed by bad roads, someone frustrated by a blocked lane, someone angry about repairs not made. These complaints became conversation. In that sense, the rainy street helped produce urban opinion. Civic frustration often begins with ordinary inconvenience discussed aloud. This matters because so much medieval governance depended on local pressure. Officials did not operate in silence. Complaints about roads, drains, and dangerous streets rose from repeated lived experience. A magistrate might ignore one bad puddle. He could not ignore 20 irritated traders discussing the same flooded approach to market. And so the lane, humble as it seems, was politically alive. Not because speeches were made there, but because shared inconvenience built consensus. People who disagreed about many things could agree that the same corner became impossible every time it rained. There is a quiet democracy in mutual annoyance. Even architecture responded over time. Raised thresholds, stones placed for stepping, overhang adjustments, drainage channels cut and recut. All these small design choices came from accumulated frustration. Medieval urban form was shaped not only by grand planning, but by generations of people trying not to step in the same mud twice. And perhaps that is why these streets deserve such close attention. They remind us that history is often written by repetition rather than spectacle. A lane becomes a problem. The problem repeats. People adapt. Someone pays for repair. Someone refuses. The lane changes slightly. Rain returns. The argument begins again. To walk there after rain was to move through the visible memory of those arguments. And if we step even closer, away from carts and market movement, away from town gates and major roads, and into the spaces beside wells, shared courtyards, washing places, and communal water sources, we find another layer entirely, because nowhere did rain, cleanliness, necessity, and neighborhood tension meet more directly than around the daily business of water itself. Nowhere did rain, cleanliness, necessity, and neighborhood tension meet more directly than around the daily business of water itself, around wells, shared courtyards, washing places, cisterns, drainage corners, and the ordinary spaces where medieval people tried to separate clean water from the rest of urban life. This is one of the quiet ironies of the medieval town. Rain was everywhere, and yet usable water was never simple. A modern viewer, standing in a city with pipes hidden behind walls and clean water arriving almost invisibly, can easily forget how much labor once surrounded a single bucket. In a medieval street, water had weight, time, and politics. It had to be found, carried, protected, and defended from contamination. After rain, all of those concerns sharpened rather than softened. Because rainwater falling from the sky was not automatically the same thing as safe water for drinking. In fact, one of the most important distinctions medieval people lived with every day was the difference between water that touched the street and water that should not. That separation was fragile. Wells stood near houses, workshops, animals, drains, and human movement. Cisterns collected rain, but roofs and gutters did not produce purity by default. Public fountains, where they existed, required trust in the system feeding them. A heavy rainfall might seem like cleansing, but it could just as easily carry filth toward the very places people depended on for health. This made the area around a well far more than a practical stop. It was a social center, a negotiation point, and sometimes a source of quiet suspicion. Imagine a shared well in a dense urban quarter after several days of rain. The ground around it is already churned by constant foot traffic. Buckets have splashed the earth soft. Children run too close. Animals pass nearby. Neighbors arrive at overlapping hours, each with their own urgency. Someone worries about runoff from a nearby drain. Someone complains that waste has been thrown too close. Someone insists the water tastes different. Someone blames a household at the end of the lane. None of this is dramatic, but it is deeply human. The well is where infrastructure becomes personal. And because water was necessary every day, these tensions repeated constantly. Unlike a market visit that might be delayed, or a social call that could wait, water could not be postponed for long. Cooking required it. Brewing required it. Cleaning required it. Animals needed it. Children needed it. Illness made it more urgent, not less. Rain might slow the street, but it did not reduce thirst. For women especially, and for servants and apprentices assigned to household work, this meant that bad weather did not remove responsibility. It simply made responsibility heavier. Carrying water through muddy lanes was not a poetic medieval image. It was wet hands, slipping shoes, and repeated trips because one household's needs exceeded one person's strength. The return journey mattered as much as the collection itself. A bucket filled at the well had to survive the street home. Avoiding spills meant slower walking. Avoiding collisions mattered. A child running past, a cart forcing someone aside, a slick stone near a doorway. Small accidents wasted effort. Water carried badly was time lost. And so people developed routes, habits, and small territorial instincts around these spaces. Certain hours were easier. Certain neighbors were more cooperative. Certain paths remained firmer after rain. Historical memory often lived in these unrecorded efficiencies. This is also where the social hierarchy of a town could become surprisingly visible. A household wealthy enough to employ servants experienced water differently from one where the same labor fell directly on family members. Access mattered. Proximity mattered. Some homes stood closer to reliable sources. Others lived with longer walks and worse conditions. Even cleanliness itself could become partly a privilege of geography. There is a common modern assumption that medieval people were simply unconcerned with cleanliness. It is one of the most persistent and least useful simplifications. They did not understand sanitation through modern germ theory, but they absolutely understood foul smells, stagnant water, spoiled food, sickness associated with bad environments, and the practical need to keep certain spaces cleaner than others. Their problem was not ignorance of discomfort. It was the difficulty of controlling it consistently in crowded urban conditions. Rain complicated that control. A heavy storm might wash a courtyard surface and leave it apparently fresher, but it could also overflow waste pits, loosen refuse, and spread contamination toward wells or entrances. In low-lying districts, standing water became its own warning. People noticed when water lingered too long. They noticed insects' smell, color, and the way animals behaved around certain places. Observation did not require modern science to be meaningful. This is why regulations about dumping, drains, and water access appear again and again in urban records. People argued about these matters because they were immediate. A dirty lane was unpleasant. A threatened water source was frightening. The courtyard intensified this feeling because it blurred the line between shared and private responsibility. In denser neighborhoods, courtyards served multiple functions at once. They could be places for washing clothes, handling food preparation, storing materials, managing animals, collecting water, or simply moving between parts of a household arrangement. After rain, these spaces became tests of cooperation. If drainage failed there, the consequences entered domestic life directly. A courtyard that stayed wet too long changed everything. Laundry dried badly. Firewood became harder to protect. Waste removal became more urgent. Walking surfaces became unreliable. Children tracked mud indoors. Arguments began over whose habits had caused the worst of it. Shared space always produces shared blame. And blame around water could last for years. Neighbors remembered who let runoff spill the wrong way. They remembered who failed to repair a broken channel. They remembered who washed unpleasant materials too close to a common source. The emotional history of a street was often stored in these repeated resentments, quieter than public law but often more powerful in daily life. Washing itself deserves more attention than it usually receives. Modern people often hear medieval hygiene and immediately imagine absence, as though people simply accepted dirt without thought. But washing existed in many forms, of hands, faces, linens, cooking tools, floors, children, and bodies, shaped by class, climate, religion, and practicality. The question was rarely whether people valued cleanliness, but how often, how thoroughly, and under what limits they could achieve it. After rain, those limits became obvious. Wet streets made carrying clean things harder. Fresh laundry risked contact with mud before it reached home. Water sources became more uncertain. Drying space became more precious. Fire needed for heating wash water competed with other household priorities. Cleanliness required labor, and labor always had to compete with survival. That competition is one of the most honest parts of history. People often knew the better choice and still could not afford it in time, energy, or money. A street after rain was full of such compromises. Shoes should be cleaned, but there is bread to bake. Water should be fetched again, but daylight is fading. The drain should be repaired, but wages are needed elsewhere. Medieval urban life was built from decisions made under limitation. Public bathhouses, where they existed and were used, add another layer to this story. They remind us that urban cleanliness was not always private or hidden. Bathing could be social, practical, and shaped by local custom. But even bathhouses depended on access, cost, reputation, and the physical movement through streets required to reach them. After rain, the irony was clear. One might go out to seek cleanliness and return carrying half the lane back with them. This did not make the effort meaningless. It made it realistic. And realism is what often disappears in romantic visions of the past. People were not living inside symbolic Middle Ages. They were trying to keep soup clean, children healthy, bedding dry, and shoes usable while the street outside refused to cooperate. Rain made domestic competence visible because it multiplied the number of small things that could go wrong. Even smell becomes a useful guide here. A courtyard after rain smelled different from a street after rain. Less movement, more trapped dampness, more intimate evidence of household life. Wet wood, cooking ash, old straw, stored vegetables, damp cloth, animal corners, and whatever the drain was failing to hide. Smell was part of navigation. People knew places partly through air before sight, and smell shaped judgment. A well-kept household announced itself not only through appearance but through the absence of certain warnings. A badly managed one could not hide as easily, especially in wet weather. Respectability was often sensory. This is another reason why rain sharpened social awareness rather than softening it. People stayed alert to one another because survival required it. Who keeps things well? Who creates avoidable trouble? Who can be trusted with shared arrangements? These were not abstract moral questions. They were practical assessments made while standing near a muddy well. And children learned them early. They learned which water was for drinking and which was not, which corner smelled wrong, which older neighbor would complain if they splashed too close to a doorway, which bucket must be handled carefully. Knowledge of the street was also knowledge of boundaries. There is something almost architectural about trust in such places. It was built slowly, maintained through repetition, and weakened quickly by neglect. A single contamination scare near a shared source could change how an entire lane behaved. People took different routes. Complaints rose. Someone demanded repairs. Someone denied responsibility. A small problem at the well could become a neighborhood event because it touched the one thing nobody could simply avoid. Water made interdependence impossible to ignore, and that interdependence extended outward into larger civic systems. Town authorities might inspect certain sources, regulate waste, protect conduits where they existed, or impose rules about what could happen near wells and drains. But enforcement always returned to ordinary behavior. No official could stand beside every bucket. Urban order depended on repeated cooperation from people who were often tired, busy, and living close to inconvenience. That is perhaps the deepest pattern in all of this. Medieval streets after rain were not difficult because people failed once. They were difficult because urban life required thousands of small successes every week, and rain exposed every place where those successes had not happened. A blocked drain, a muddy threshold, a foul corner near a well. These were not isolated details. They were signs of how fragile the system always was. And if the well and courtyard showed that fragility at the level of the household, then the next place it became unmistakable was in the world of trade itself, where wet streets met open stalls, food spoilage, crowded markets, and the daily challenge of trying to sell something clean in a city that had just been soaked. Where wet streets met open stalls, food spoilage, crowded markets, and the daily challenge of trying to sell something clean in a city that had just been soaked. The medieval town revealed perhaps its most practical contradiction of all. Commerce depended on order, but commerce itself constantly helped create disorder. The market square after rain was not simply muddy. It was unstable in every sense, physical, economic, and social. To understand why, it helps to remember that medieval markets were not occasional decorative events. They were the heartbeat of urban survival. Bread, fish, grain, vegetables, salt, cloth, candles, meat, tools, firewood. These were not luxury purchases. They were the daily structure of life. A bad market day was not disappointing, could be genuinely disruptive. Rain changed the market before the first customer arrived. Sellers woke earlier to judge conditions. Could the cart make it through? Would goods arrive damaged? Was it worth setting up in the usual place if the ground there was already soft? Did coverings need repair? Could fish still be sold respectably if the street around the stall smelled worse than usual? Would fewer buyers come, or would necessity force the same crowd into worse conditions? The answer most often was that necessity won. People still needed food, and so the market opened anyway, but the entire logic of movement shifted. A square that might feel open and efficient and dry weather became a negotiation of puddles, boards, baskets, hooves, skirts, shouting, and patience. Every footstep became part of a larger choreography of inconvenience. The butcher cared about mud for different reasons than the cloth seller. The fishmonger worried differently than the baker. Rain did not affect the market evenly, touched each trade through its own vulnerability. Take bread, for example. Bread sounds stable, almost immune to weather compared to fresh fish or fruit. But bread depended on grain arriving, flour staying dry, fuel remaining usable, customers reaching the stall, and physical handling that did not turn simple transactions into contamination. A wet street slowed grain transport before the loaf even existed. By the time the baker stood at market, rain had already shaped the price. Fish was worse. In many towns, especially inland ones, fish required speed and reputation. Freshness mattered, and freshness was fragile. A delayed road, a broken wheel, a flooded approach, or even a crowded gate could shorten the useful life of what was being sold. Rain changed smell, and smell changed trust. A customer deciding whether to buy fish was not simply judging appearance. They were judging the invisible confidence that the journey had gone well enough. Meat sellers faced similar tensions. Clean display mattered, but clean display was harder when streets splashed upward. Animals arriving for slaughter came through the same wet roads as everyone else. Waste disposal became more urgent in warm, wet conditions. Complaints rose faster where smell lingered. This is where modern assumptions about medieval filth often miss something important. People were not casually indifferent to spoiled food or foul surroundings. They were living inside a system where maintaining acceptable standards required constant effort against material conditions that resisted them. Concern existed. Perfect control did not. Cloth merchants had their own version of the problem. Mud and wetness were enemies of presentation. A respectable piece of fabric needed protection not only from rain itself but from the street carrying that rain upward. A customer browsing with dirty hems and wet hands changed the interaction. Market space after rain demanded physical defense of goods. Elevated tables, coverings, careful handling, all became part of selling trust. Even small sellers, eggs, herbs, onions, candles, had to think in terms of surface and access. Where could a basket be placed without sinking or splashing? Which edge of the square stayed firmer? Which route customers would still use? The geography of value changed with the weather, and this meant that market position mattered enormously. A stall near the church wall, under partial shelter, or on better paving could be worth more than one across a softer stretch of ground. Access to dryness was a form of economic privilege. Long before indoor shopping existed, location already created hierarchy. Rain made that hierarchy obvious. The social life of the market sharpened too. People noticed who arrived late. They noticed who blamed the roads, whose goods looked poorer, whose stall remained cleaner, whose prices rose suspiciously after bad weather. Rain was information. It explained, but it also invited suspicion. If grain prices climbed, was it truly the roads, or was someone taking advantage? If meat looked poor, was the journey too slow, or had the seller simply lowered standards? If one merchant managed well while another struggled, was that skill, luck, or access to better infrastructure? Markets were places of memory, and memory made trust slow to build and quick to lose. A customer might forgive one bad loaf or one questionable fish. Repeated disappointments became reputation. After rain, reputation was tested harder because the excuse of bad conditions was both real and easy to abuse. This made regulation necessary but never simple. Town authorities often watched markets closely because food supply and public order were politically dangerous subjects. Bad bread, dishonest measures, spoiled meat, obstructed stalls, blocked access. These were not minor inconveniences. They threatened confidence in the town itself. Officials could inspect, fine, or issue rules, but rules still met mud at ground level. A regulation about clean selling space means less if the approach road is half flooded. This is why medieval market order was often practical rather than idealistic. The goal was not perfection. It was enough stability that buying and selling could continue without anger becoming disorder. Civic peace sometimes depended on whether people could purchase onions without losing a shoe. That sounds almost humorous, but it is historically serious. When ordinary necessities become physically exhausting, tempers shorten. Crowded wet markets produced arguments not because medieval people were uniquely volatile, but because frustration accumulates fastest around basic needs. Hunger and mud are not a graceful combination. There was also a sensory intensity to these spaces that modern people rarely imagine fully. A rainy market did not smell like one thing. It smelled like wet animals, damp wool, fresh bread, fish, smoke, onions, leather, straw, spilled ale, wet wood, and the earth itself churned into paste by 100 feet. The sound was equally layered. Vendors calling, carts forcing passage, church bells in the distance, customers negotiating prices, children weaving through danger with alarming confidence. The street and the market were not separate places. They were the same organism. And this is where class returned again, quietly but firmly. A wealthy buyer might send servants. A poor laborer came personally, carrying the burden of movement with the burden of price. To shop after rain was harder for those whose time and clothing were least protected. Better shoes, covered transport, more flexible schedules. These softened inconvenience. Poverty meant standing in it. Even credit worked differently in bad weather. A delayed customer, a late delivery, a spoiled good. These could shift small debts and obligations. Medieval economies ran partly on trust and repeated relationships. Rain entered those relationships. It could delay payment, justify negotiation, or quietly deepen dependency. Women managing household budgets often carried this pressure most directly. They had to judge not only what could be bought, but whether the condition of the market made the trip worth the cost in time and effort. A cheaper price at a farther stall might mean crossing worse ground. A trusted seller might be chosen partly because the path there was safer. Domestic economics included geography. Children and apprentices learned trade in this environment, not in clean abstraction. They learned how to carry goods through mud, how to protect inventory from weather, how to read customer mood, and how to interpret the square itself. Which corner floods first? Which stone stays safest? Which customers complain most after rain? Commercial intelligence began at the ankle, and there was always the question of waste. Markets created leftovers. Spoiled produce, fish remains, blood, broken straw, damaged containers, spilled grain. After rain, disposal became urgent. Leave too much too long, and the square became harder to use tomorrow. But removing waste required labor, agreement, and someone willing to pay for both. This is where civic responsibility returned once more. Clean trade depended on collective effort after private profit had already been made. That tension never disappears. Who benefits from the market and who cleans after it? In many ways, medieval towns asked that question constantly. Rain made the answer visible because it slowed forgetting. What should have been carried away stayed longer in wet ground. The square remembered yesterday's commerce under today's footsteps. Festivals and special market days intensified all of this. Larger crowds meant deeper mud, faster spoilage, more animals, and greater opportunity for conflict. But they also meant greater civic importance. A town could tolerate ordinary inconvenience, could not easily tolerate embarrassment during visible public events. Rain before a major fair was not only a practical issue. It was a test of prestige. Officials, merchants, and residents all felt that pressure differently, but they felt it together. This is one reason public paving projects often centered around major market approaches. It was not charity. It was protection of economic identity. A prosperous town needed routes that looked and felt capable of prosperity. Still, even the best-maintained square could not fully defeat weather. People adapted instead. Temporary boards appeared. Straw was thrown down. Stall positions shifted. Deliveries were rerouted. Complaints were repeated. Trade continued. That continuation is perhaps the most important part. The medieval market after rain was not a symbol of failure. It was a demonstration of persistence. People bought bread anyway. They sold cloth anyway. They argued over fish anyway. Urban life did not wait for ideal conditions because it never had ideal conditions to wait for. And if the market showed how commerce fought against mud in public, then the tavern and alehouse showed what happened afterward. When wet boots crossed the threshold, when frustration turned into conversation, and when the street outside became the subject of the room inside. When wet boots crossed the threshold, when frustration turned into conversation, and when the street outside became the subject of the room inside, the tavern and alehouse revealed another truth about medieval streets after rain. Inconvenience was rarely silent. A tavern after bad weather was not only a place of drink. It was a place where the town interpreted itself. People arrived carrying visible evidence of the road. Mud on the hem, soaked cloaks steaming near the fire, boots left heavier than they had been that morning. The smell of wet leather, damp wool, and horse sweat entering before the person fully did. No explanation was needed at first. The street announced itself through the body. This made taverns strangely honest spaces. A merchant could claim the journey had been easy, but the state of his cartman's boots said otherwise. A traveler could pretend confidence, but the exhausted horse outside offered its own testimony. Rain removed a layer of social performance because discomfort left physical proof. And once inside, those proofs became conversation. The blocked lane near the market, the cart stuck outside the east gate, the slippery stones near the church steps, the butcher blamed for worsening the smell by the south square, the magistrate who promised repairs last spring and had done very little since. These were not grand political speeches, but they were the raw material of local opinion. A medieval town often governed itself through repeated complaints long before formal action arrived. This is why taverns mattered historically far beyond drinking. They were information exchanges. News traveled with merchants, but judgment traveled with residents. People compared stories. They measured whether their own frustration was personal bad luck or shared civic failure. If enough people complained about the same flooded crossing, the problem stopped being private irritation and became public evidence. Rain gave people something specific to agree on. There is a quiet social power in mutual inconvenience. People divided by trade, class, or temperament could still unite around the certainty that the same street had become impossible after every storm. Shared annoyance is one of history's most reliable forms of community. And alehouses were particularly suited to this because they sat close to ordinary life. They were not distant halls of official authority. They were warm, familiar rooms where laborers, craftsmen, servants, merchants, and travelers could all cross paths, though not always as equals. The conversation about streets was often more democratic there than in council chambers. That does not mean these spaces were peaceful. Quite the opposite. Rain shortened tempers before people ever sat down. Delayed deliveries meant lost money. Wet travel meant exhaustion. Slippery streets meant accidents and embarrassment. By the time someone reached the alehouse, the argument had often already begun in the mind. A spilled drink, a disputed price, a complaint repeated too sharply. Small things could grow quickly when the entire town felt physically inconvenient. But even conflict reveals structure. Who complained safely and who did not told its own story about power. A wealthy merchant criticizing road conditions sounded different from a laborer doing the same. A guild member with influence could turn tavern frustration into civic pressure more effectively than a servant could. The room was shared, but authority was not evenly distributed. Still, everyone listened. This matters because much of medieval urban change did not begin with visionary planning. It began with accumulated irritation made impossible to ignore. The paving of a troublesome street, the cleaning of a blocked drain, the repair of a market approach. These often followed not abstract improvement plans, but repeated public embarrassment and practical anger. Someone had to be tired enough of the same mud. And taverns recorded that exhaustion in human form. Think of the innkeeper or alewife near a busy road after a week of rain. They became accidental witnesses to infrastructure. They heard every version of the same story. The North Road is worse than last month. The bridge near the mill is half unusable. The lane by the tanner is unbearable. The market square smells worse after each storm. Long before officials received formal complaints, tavern keepers already knew the condition of the town. Their business depended on it. A tavern near the gate profited from bad roads because weary travelers needed shelter. But bad roads also damaged supplies, delayed deliveries, and brought exhausted customers less willing to spend generously. Prosperity and inconvenience arrived together. Medieval commerce was often like that. One person's problem was another person's business opportunity, but never perfectly. Ale itself belonged to this story more than modern people sometimes realize. Safe and practical daily drinking habits were shaped by water quality, household production, and local economy. Brewing required clean enough conditions, reliable ingredients, and stable transport. Rain affected grain supply, fuel use, and market access. Even a simple cup at the table was connected to the street outside. Nothing in the town was truly separate from the road. Inside the room, floor conditions told their own version of the weather. Fresh straw might be spread to manage mud and dampness. Shoes tracked in the day's argument. Fireplaces fought not just cold, but wetness itself. Cloaks were hung, boots scraped, benches crowded more closely because people preferred warmth over elegance. Comfort was practical, not decorative. This created a particular kind of intimacy. People sat close because architecture and weather encouraged it. Stories were overheard. Complaints spread. News mixed with gossip and gossip with policy. A flooded street near a wealthy property might become a moral judgment about neglect. A merchant repeatedly blaming weather might become suspected of using rain as an excuse for bad trade. Streets shaped reputation even indoors. There is also the question of hospitality. For strangers arriving from outside town, the tavern was often their first interpretation of urban life. Before they saw the council hall or the cathedral, they saw the road in, the gate, and the room where they dried themselves. If that road was miserable and the tavern full of the same complaint, then the town acquired a character before formal business even began. Reputation traveled outward from such moments. A place known for difficult winter roads, flooded approaches, or filthy market lanes was remembered. Traders talked. Pilgrims compared routes. Craftsmen seeking work listened. Medieval urban identity depended partly on stories told over evening drink by people removing wet boots. This is one reason towns invested, however imperfectly, in visible approaches and important thoroughfares. Not because every ruler loved civic beauty, but because embarrassment is expensive. A merchant who chooses another route next season because last year's journey was intolerable changes the town's future in quiet ways. Rain could influence trade through memory, and memory, in taverns especially, was selective. People remembered discomfort more clearly than efficiency. Nobody praised the road that caused no trouble. They remembered the wheel lost in mud, the horse slipping near the bridge, the barrel spoiled because delivery took too long. Infrastructure became famous mainly through failure. That is still true now, though we rarely think of it as historical continuity. There were also gendered boundaries in these spaces worth noticing. Not every tavern functioned the same way, and not every person moved through them with equal ease. Some alehouses were deeply tied to household economies and local neighborhood life. Others leaned more heavily toward travelers, trade, and male public culture. Women worked within them, managed them, used them, and navigated them differently depending on place and class. Rain affected those movements too. A journey avoided after dark and dry weather might be entirely unwelcome after wet streets and poor visibility. Safety, once again, was physical before it was abstract. Returning home from an evening gathering after rain meant more than inconvenience. It meant darkness, uncertain footing, narrow lanes, and the knowledge that a simple fall on slick stones could become serious. The tavern was warm partly because leaving it required courage measured in very ordinary terms. And yet leave people did, because tomorrow still required work. This is perhaps the most consistent emotional note in all of this history. Persistence without drama. Medieval people did not spend every rainy day in constant misery, nor did they float through picturesque hardship with romantic patience. They complained, adapted, laughed, cursed, helped, blamed, repaired, delayed, and carried on. The tavern after rain was not the end of the problem. It was the pause between one encounter with the street and the next. Morning would come. The same lane would still be wet. That repetition shaped urban psychology more deeply than rare disasters. Floods and fires were memorable, but ordinary rain taught the city who it really was. It revealed maintenance failures, social dependence, weak planning, good neighbors, bad habits, and the stubborn fact that civilization often rests on whether enough people keep doing small, unpleasant things. Cleaning drains, replacing straw, repairing thresholds, checking roofs, lifting goods higher, warning children away from dangerous corners, complaining until someone with authority finally listens. These are not heroic acts, but they are how towns survive. And nowhere was that survival more visible than in winter, when rain mixed with cold, when mud thickened into something harsher, and when the medieval street stopped being merely inconvenient and began to test endurance itself. When rain mixed with cold, when mud thickened into something harsher, and when the medieval street stopped being merely inconvenient and began to test endurance itself, the entire emotional texture of urban life changed. Winter did not simply make the same problems colder, transformed them. A wet autumn street was frustrating. A winter street could be dangerous. This is one of the places where modern imagination often softens reality too much. People picture medieval winter through snow on rooftops, smoke from chimneys, perhaps a quiet beauty in narrow streets under frost. And certainly, there were moments of visual stillness. But underfoot, winter was often less picturesque than unstable. Streets shifted between mud, slush, frozen ruts, black ice, standing water that refroze by evening, and pathways so uneven that every step demanded attention. The danger was not always dramatic. It was cumulative. A horse slipping on frozen stone near a market entrance. A cart will catching in hardened mud from yesterday's rain. A servant carrying hot broth losing footing near a doorway. An older resident walking more slowly to church because the lane had become treacherous after dusk. None of these moments sound like major history, yet together they shaped what winter meant. Cold turned ordinary mistakes into larger consequences. In warmer rain, wet feet were unpleasant. In winter, they threatened illness, discomfort that lingered for days, and the slow exhaustion of never fully drying. Leather shoes soaked in freezing slush did not simply inconvenience the wearer. They carried cold back into the house, into sleep, into the next day's labor. Warmth became harder to recover than it was to lose. This mattered especially because medieval clothing, while often practical and more resilient than modern stereotypes suggest, still had limits. Wool helped, cloaks helped, layering helped, but repeated wetness in freezing conditions wore down comfort quickly. Hems froze stiff, hands numbed. Wet garments dried slowly in homes where heat was precious and fuel was never casually abundant. Winter streets therefore connected directly to household economics. A bad walk through town might mean more firewood needed that evening, more drying near the hearth, more strain on already limited fuel supplies. Cold outside followed people indoors, and fuel itself depended on roads. Firewood, charcoal, peat in some regions, these had to be moved. If winter roads became unreliable, warmth became more expensive. The street, after freezing rain, was not just a walking problem. It was a heating problem, a cooking problem, a survival problem. A delayed cart of wood could alter the rhythm of an entire neighborhood. This is where the medieval street reveals its deepest honesty. Infrastructure was not a separate subject from comfort. It was comfort. A better road meant warmer rooms. A safer bridge meant more reliable bread. A cleaner lane meant less sickness carried to the threshold. Luxury was often disguised as stability, and winter made that truth impossible to ignore. The market square in cold rain had a different mood from the same square in spring mud. There was less patience in it. Buyers moved faster. Sellers protected goods more urgently. Fish froze at the edges while boots slipped in half-frozen muck. Butchers dealt with different problems of preservation, though cold could help some goods even as movement became harder. Bakers worried about delayed grain and wet fuel. Everyone watched the sky. Winter markets were less forgiving because mistakes lasted longer. A loaf spoiled in summer was one problem. A missed delivery in winter, when travel was worse and reserves mattered more, could feel heavier. Households planned around weather not as inconvenience but as strategy. When roads hardened badly or storms repeated, people adjusted expectations of what could be bought, when, and from whom. Children experienced this world differently, but not safely. Frozen puddles invited play until they became falls. Snow concealed broken surfaces. Ice near wells and drains turned familiar corners into traps. A child running too quickly in summer might come home dirty. In winter, the same mistake could bring bruises, broken goods, or far more trouble. The elderly felt the street with even sharper realism. For someone whose balance was less certain, winter movement became negotiation with risk. A trip to church, to market, to visit kin, or simply to fetch something necessary could not be taken lightly when streets froze unevenly. Community mattered here. Assistance mattered. A neighbor carrying part of a load or helping across a dangerous stretch was not kindness in an abstract moral sense. It was the structure of survivable urban life. This is another place where medieval towns reveal themselves as systems of dependence rather than isolated households. People endured winter partly because others noticed when they struggled. But winter also sharpened inequality. A wealthy household might send servants into the worst weather, buy fuel more securely, own stronger footwear, or remain indoors longer when conditions were poor. A laborer walked because labor demanded it. A servant crossed town because someone else's comfort depended on it. Poverty meant exposure measured in weather. This is perhaps one of the most overlooked historical luxuries: the ability to stay inside. To remain by the fire while others tested the street was a privilege as real as fine cloth or silver. Winter streets made class visible through movement itself. And still, civic life continued. Bells still rang. Courts still met. Deliveries still had to arrive. Animals still needed care. Medieval urban resilience was built not on ideal conditions but on the assumption that work must continue through bad ones. This produced remarkable practical intelligence. People learned which streets froze first, which routes held sunlight longest, which paving stones were dangerously smooth after sleet, where thawed water refroze near drains, which gate approaches became impossible for heavy carts, and which bridges should be avoided after dark. This knowledge was not written in maps. It lived in bodies and routine. A stranger entering town in winter lacked more than directions. They lacked survival knowledge. This helps explain why inns and taverns near gates became even more important in cold weather. Travelers needed information as much as shelter. Which road ahead is passable? Has the bridge near the mill frozen badly? Is the north lane safe for a loaded wagon? Advice exchanged over firelight could save time, goods, or injury the next day. Winter made local knowledge valuable currency. And sound changed again. Frozen streets sounded sharper. Hooves struck stone differently. Wheels jarred harder over hardened ruts. Footsteps on crusted surfaces announced movement more clearly. Silence itself felt different because cold changed how people occupied public space. There were fewer idle pauses, fewer lingering conversations outdoors. People moved with purpose. But where ice formed over standing filth, there was another strange irony. The street could appear cleaner than it was. A frozen surface gave temporary order to underlying disorder. Mud hardened. Smells softened in cold air. Puddles became solid. A visitor might briefly think the town improved in winter, when in fact the same problems remained suspended beneath frost, waiting for thaw. And thaw was often worse. This is one of the least romantic parts of medieval winter. The moment when cold breaks and frozen streets begin to collapse back into movement is not relief so much as transition into a different misery. Ruts deepen. Ice becomes slush. Stored waste reappears. The town smells like return. Spring mud after winter freeze could feel heavier than autumn rain because it arrived after months of strain. Roads weakened. Supplies were tired. Tempers short. The street seemed to remember everything winter had hidden. This cycle mattered psychologically. People did not experience weather as isolated events. They anticipated the known suffering of certain seasons. The dangerous church steps in January. The foul lane in thaw. The market approach that fails every late winter. Memory prepared the body before the sky changed. And memory shaped civic pressure. A repeatedly dangerous crossing was not forgotten simply because spring arrived. Winter accidents lingered in conversation. A broken cart, a fall, a delayed funeral procession, a lost delivery. These stories returned when repairs were discussed. Seasonal hardship often produced political action because repetition made denial difficult. Even religious life bent around winter streets. Feast days, processions, parish obligations, funerals, none of these existed outside weather. A burial after freezing rain moved through real mud and real ice. Mourning included logistics. Sacred calendars met physical roads. The priest slipping slightly near the cemetery gate belonged to the same history as the prayer itself. Again and again, the lesson returns. Medieval life was never divided neatly between symbolic meaning and practical difficulty. They occupied the same step, and winter made that step literal. Consider the simple act of carrying water in freezing weather. Wells became more dangerous. Buckets were heavier with numb hands. Paths were less trustworthy. Spilled water near a doorway could become ice by evening, turning domestic work into tomorrow's hazard. One task created the next problem. That chain of consequence defined winter urban life. A wet threshold became a fall. A delayed cart became a colder house. A blocked drain became dangerous ice. A broken shoe became days of discomfort. Nothing remained small for long because cold amplified weakness. And yet people still found rhythms inside it. Markets adapted. Households rationed. Neighbors warned each other. Streets developed unofficial winter routes. Straw appeared where stone was too slick. Children learned caution through repetition. Taverns filled earlier. Complaints became seasonal rituals. Human beings are remarkably skilled at normalizing difficulty when difficulty repeats long enough. That normalization should not be mistaken for ease. People were not comfortable. They were practiced. There is dignity in that distinction. The medieval street after winter rain was not conquered. It was endured with intelligence. It taught humility because it could not be fully controlled. The town remained dependent on weather despite walls, despite laws, despite ambition. Civilization still slipped on ice. And perhaps nowhere did that vulnerability become more visible than during the moments when the street had to serve not trade or routine but ceremony. When weddings, funerals, religious festivals, and public processions tried to move with dignity through roads that had no respect for dignity at all. And perhaps nowhere did that vulnerability become more visible than during the moments when the street had to serve not trade or routine, but ceremony. When weddings, funerals, religious festivals, and public processions tried to move with dignity through roads that had no respect for dignity at all. It is easy to imagine ceremony as something that rises above ordinary life, but in the medieval town, ceremony still had to cross the same streets as everyone else. A wedding procession did not float through romance. It stepped around puddles. A funeral did not move only through solemn silence. It moved through mud, through narrow lanes, through the practical problem of carrying grief and a coffin at the same time. A religious feast day did not suspend the town's physical reality. Clergy, guild members, musicians, officials, and ordinary parishioners still had to navigate slick stones, blocked approaches, dripping eaves, and streets softened by the week's rain. And perhaps that is the most honest ending to all of this. What medieval streets felt like after rain was never just a question of mud. It was a question of how a society held itself together when comfort could not be assumed. The street after rain exposed everything at once. Class, because some people could avoid the worst of it and others could not. Trade, because a delayed cart could become an expensive week. Governance, because blocked drains and broken paving revealed what authorities valued enough to repair. Reputation, because neighbors watched how one another managed shared inconvenience. Religion, because even sacred life had to walk through the same filth as daily labor. And memory, because people remembered the street not as architecture, but as feeling, where they slipped, where they waited, where they arrived cold and tired. Modern people often search history for dramatic differences, for kings, wars, and great inventions. But sometimes the clearest understanding comes from something smaller and far more familiar. The unpleasant walk home in bad weather. That is where the Middle Ages become strangely recognizable. A person lifting a hem to avoid muddy water. A merchant worrying whether the road delayed grain. Parent frustrated by wet shoes at the doorway. A priest crossing a dangerous lane before dawn. A child knowing exactly which stone stays safest after rain. These are not distant people living inside a mythic past. They are people solving ordinary problems inside different material limits. And perhaps that is why the rainy medieval street matters so much. Because it refuses romance. It reminds us that history was lived through bodies. Cold feet, heavy buckets, wet wool, tired animals, sore backs, slippery steps, and the quiet exhaustion of repeating the same practical battle every season. Civilization was not only built in castles and cathedrals. It was maintained in drains, thresholds, paving stones, and the patient decision to clean the same muddy entrance one more time. There is something deeply human in that. Not heroic exactly, not glamorous, but real. The street after rain was where illusion ended. It showed whether a town actually worked. It revealed which systems were strong enough to survive weather and which were only respectable in dry sunlight. It made everyone, rich or poor, confront the same ground, even if they did not suffer it equally. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson beneath all of it. Comfort is historical. The dry pavement we barely notice today would have felt like luxury to countless people who spent their lives negotiating mud, runoff, frozen ruts, and uncertain footing. Convenience, so often invisible in the present, becomes obvious only when imagined without it. To understand the medieval street after rain is to understand that most of history was not lived at the level of grand events, but at the level of surfaces, what it felt like to leave home, to reach market, to return before dark, to carry water without spilling it, to arrive at church without falling, to keep dignity while your shoes sank into the road. That was history too. And for many people, it was the history that mattered most. So the next time rain hits a city street, and you hear it against windows or watch people stepping carefully around puddles, it may be worth remembering how old that instinct is. For centuries, people have measured the quality of a place by what happens after the storm. Not by how beautiful it looks from a distance, but by whether life can still move through it. And if there was one thing medieval people understood with perfect clarity, it was that a town was only as good as the road that carried you home. If this was the part of history that surprised you most, the simple, uncomfortable reality beneath the romantic image, I'd love to know which detail stayed with you. And if you enjoy these quieter journeys into the past, subscribe and come back again. There is always another ordinary corner of history waiting to be looked at properly. Until next time, sleep well and good night.